Hello, and thank you very much for taking 30 minutes out of your day to join this webinar on the main findings from the IPCC's fifth assessment report, and most importantly, the implications for business. I'm Jonathan Shopley. I'm Managing Director here at the CarbonNeutral Company in London. The CarbonNeutral Company doing climate solutions to business for over 15 years. And we are really privileged to count companies including Avis, B-Sky-B, Bain & Co., Coca-Cola, Marks & Spencer's, Microsoft, Pureprint, and UPS amongst those who've used us to design and deliver competitive greenhouse gas reduction strategies built on internal reductions, renewable energy, and on carbon offsetting. So we're thrilled to have 60 people registered from across Europe and North America signed up today. I'm going to present for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to turn over to you for questions. Now, if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so throughout the presentation via the question tab on the control panel that you should see on your screen. Type in your question and press send. We'll collect these through the presentation, and I'll address them at the end in the Q&A. So, to kick off, why? If you cast your mind back 5 years to 2007, that was the last time the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reported on the science of climate change. 2 years later, in 2009, at the Climate Summit in Copenhagen, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change failed really to translate that evidence into a coordinated global policy. And that gap between the evidence and policy action made climate the top media topic for a number of years. For many businesses, those events framed their strategic responses to climate change. And then, well, then we went into economic meltdown. 2 weeks ago, the IPCC published the first of the 3 reports that will make up its 5th assessment report on the science of climate change, drawing from 330 scientists from across 85 countries. And hundreds of experts have worked on specific areas of the report as contributing editors, and thousands more have contributed as expert reviewers. So as this neat IPCC graphic on this opening slide shows, this first report covers the scientific basis of how and why climate is changing and how it might change in the future. The 36-page document summarizing the full Working Group Report 1 was reviewed literally line by line by the contributing scientists and policymakers from across the globe, and they signed off on every element of it. So now that it's released, this first of the 3-part series, it's going to stimulate a wide and deep review of policy and regulatory responses to climate change, and it will certainly reignite the debate about whether we are doing too much or too little, given our understanding of the risks that climate change poses over the short and long term. It cannot, as signs of economic recovery are strengthening, and also 2 years ahead of the 2015 UN Climate Summit that's scheduled for December 2015 in Paris, when all nations have committed to finalizing a global agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol in 2020. So, what does the report say? Working Group Report 1 sets a confidence level of 95% certainty that human activities, such as burning fossil fuels, have been the main cause for climate change since the 1950s. That's a jump from 90% certainty in 2007, 66% certainty in 2001, and 50% certainty in 1995 when these reports really first hit the scene. The report links a 40% rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations over the past 150 years to the 500 billion tons of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, mainly from fossil fuel, used during this time. it explains that limiting emissions to another 500 billion tons or less over the coming few decades will still cause average atmospheric temperatures to rise somewhere between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 4.5 degrees by 2100, relative to the period 1850 to the 1900s. So that's by way of introduction. Before I get into the meat of this, I just want to acknowledge that while the opinions in this webinar are ours or mine, we really are drawing on excellent work that's been done by a number of organizations. Cambridge University's Program for Sustainable Leadership has committed to making the findings of the IPCC reports accessible to non-scientific community. The CDP, used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project, tracks corporate response. HSBC's analysts do some very interesting work in this space. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has really, this time around, paid an enormous amount of attention to making their very, very scientific and long reports accessible as well. The OECD tracks policy responses to the science, and our own white paper, which you could find on our website on the subject, are all as background to what now follows. So, changing climate really is a risk multiplier. And it's a risk multiplier because there's little certainty, I shouldn't say little, there's growing certainty about the outcomes, but nothing is ever certain. So really, if we were to summarize the report, it says that human activities, particularly emissions of carbon dioxide, are causing sustained and unequivocal rise in global temperatures. Those rising global temperatures are causing sea levels to rise, an increase in ocean acidity, but most importantly, increasing extreme weather events, making some regions much wetter, some much drier, and melting glaciers. Governments and policymakers are really going to have to act to protect society, the economy, and the environment by constraining greenhouse gas emissions over the next 50 to 100 years. And finally, the good news here is that business is already responding, but it will be expected to do a lot more, both by governments and by their customers and consumers. So this is an issue of increasing strategic importance, and the IPCC report marks a line in the sand on that particular point. Now, if we just go into a little more detail around the science before we get on to the business implications. On this slide, what you can see is a graphic of the IPCC's reports or findings on rising temperatures. And here's what the report says about past temperatures. Raised concentrations of greenhouse gases are trapping solar energy and causing temperatures to rise. That's heating the atmosphere, land and sea, but actually 90% of the increased energy trapped in the atmosphere is now heating the oceans. So in each of the last 3 decades, we have seen successive warming, more warming than the preceding decade since 1850. Now, there we go. Sorry for that hiatus. Now, the report focuses on the data and also makes predictions as what's going to happen in the future. And the IPCC has used 4 scenarios to predict that future. On this chart, you'll see the RCPs. There are 4 of them. And RCP means representative concentration pathway, and each of which projects a certain amount of carbon to be emitted by 2100. So, for example, RCP 8.5 reflects business as usual, which is really the worst case scenario where we are unable to constrain or unwilling to constrain greenhouse gas emissions. And on the other side, on the other extreme, there's RCP 2.6, which represents a scenario where emissions are halved by 2050, a best-case scenario. Only RCP 2.6 anticipates global mean temperatures of around 1.5 degrees Celsius, while the RCP 8.6 anticipates 4.5 degrees. Or in IPCC, global mean surface temperature in the atmosphere at land and ocean surfaces by the end of the 21st century is more than two-thirds certain to be in the range of 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius for the worst-case scenario, and between 0.3 and 1.7 degrees Celsius for the best-case scenario. So if we now look at what that all means for sea level rise, and again, in IPCC speak, by the end of the 21st century, sea level is more than two-thirds certain to be in the range of 0.45 to 0.82 meters higher for the worst-case scenario, and between 2.6 and 0.55 meters for the best case. And what that does mean, of course, is that extreme weather events, that rise in sea level with extreme weather events really puts a lot of our coastal infrastructure at risk. Now, if we look at the disruptions from climate change on this next slide, what we can see is that every region of the world is impacted, but differently. So it's virtually certain that by 2100 there'll be more unusually hot and fewer unusually cold days almost everywhere. Longer, more frequent heat waves are more than 90% certain, and although unusually cold winters may still occur from time to time, but the main takeaway from this graphic is the fact that this is unevenly spread, and you can see greater degrees of warming in the northern latitudes and in Latin America and particularly in Africa. Now, if you look at the same sort of distribution on rainfall on this next slide, we can see the same sort of effect. Drier areas becoming drier, wetter areas becoming wetter. And extreme rainfall events are much more frequent, and then they become much more stronger and more frequent in the mid-latitudes and the wet tropical areas. Now, although the IPCC report does not look at second-order impacts, that's going to be the subject of the second report in the series of 3 that will represent the whole Assessment Report 5 series. We, in business, already know and understand that climate change really is at the nexus of a number of core services that we benefit from on a daily basis, and that's really the energy, the water, and the agriculture nexus. And I mean, that was made very real to me a couple of weeks ago when I was in the northern region of Kenya, where water stresses from a hotter climate in that part of Africa are already affecting water supplies and food supply chains into the UK. While we're on water, data is already showing us that freshwater sources are coming under increasing pressure, largely through population growth, but increasingly that will be exacerbated by changing climate, the hotter regions that I mentioned earlier. And now, moving away for a moment from the scientific findings of the IPCC report and focusing a little more on the policy response, as I mentioned in the opening statements of this webinar, if we cast our mind back to 2007, 2008, 2009, we really saw the political appetite to take action on climate change wane. And this graph from HSBC's research shows that very well, how 2013 really is expected to be the low point on policy. But we are now expecting, as a report, for that to increase. But one thing that is evident from an OECD report that came out just yesterday is that all you need is not more policy but good policy rather than just lots of it. So in the report, Climate and Carbon, Aligning Prices and Policies, the OECD makes the point that market-based approaches are 16 times more cost-effective at cutting greenhouse gases than, say, renewable subsidies paid to power producers. It notes that the cost of reducing carbon dioxide in the electricity generating industry using emissions trading systems is around 10 euros a metric ton on average, compared to about 150 euros for feed-in tariffs, with some feed-in tariffs costing more than 700 euros a ton. Now, policy takes us on to another point, and it's always worth reminding us, as I does, that countries with the least regulation, represented by the non-Annex 1 curve on the slide in Kyoto Protocol speak, are those growing their greenhouse gas emissions at the fastest rate. And while we can outsource our manufacturing of products that we use on a day-to-day basis to countries like China and India, emissions from these rapidly developing economies are being felt globally. And so whatever we do in one part of the world affects us all. So now I'd like to move on a little to look at how businesses are being impacted. And as the title here says, either by driving change, i.e. as an emitter, driving change as a solution to climate change by reducing greenhouse gases, or be changed by the effects of climate change if we are too laissez-faire about the impacts. Now, business can adapt probably better than any other sector of society. It's very good. It's the heart of business to assess and manage risks. And we generally put that at the core of business strategy. New technologies are going to be key, and businesses are great innovators. And furthermore, right now, most of the developed economies' governments are short on cash, but if you look at most of the world's biggest companies, they're sitting on balance sheets, which means that they have the financial resources to make those innovations, and certainly more than government. But there are challenges. Many businesses, most of our businesses, all of our businesses actually have grown up in the fossil fuel era, and we all have assets which, if we change to a low-carbon future, could become stranded or obsolete. There's work from Carbon Tracker which says that there are 3 times more oil, gas, and coal reserves reported in the companies represented on the major stock exchanges around the world than we could possibly burn if we plan to stabilize climate. The CDP reports looking at performance, corporate performance among the S&P 500 show that great progress is being made, but really incrementally, nothing that would get us onto the RCP 2.6 curve of a halving of emissions by mid-century. And then, of course, as I've just mentioned, the global nature of climate change, whatever we do has to be done on an international and global basis. So one of the things that the IPCC has done well is invest in great graphics to communicate the work that it's reporting. And on this particular graph, Carbon at the Crossroads, what it says is that in the worst case scenario on the left-hand side, which is the RCP 8.5, where it's business as usual, what we would see then is a continued use of fossil fuels and continued emissions of greenhouse gases, which would really put our economy and environment, natural environment, under great stress. However, if we do find a pathway to the RCP 2.6 scenario, where we invest in new technologies and innovations, and some of them somewhat disruptive, we can see a change to a low-carbon future that will be much more stable for us. Now, talking for a moment about creative disruption and the power of innovation on behalf of business, here's an interesting slide just to make that point. It shows really that creative disruption in the solar power generation sector has seen costs of solar modules drop to the point where this form of renewables is no longer the overpriced green alternative. And there's a sense that in that particular space of renewable energy, we're following what the IT sector called Moore's Law, a doubling of the capacity and the halving of the price of generation almost on a year-by-year basis. Now, the one thing, again, speaking to the theme of innovation and businesses' ability to lead, is we think that as we look around some of the companies that we work with, that innovation is already taking place on quite a material level. Sky, for example, in addition to its carbon neutral commitments, has really invested heavily in on-site renewables. Microsoft has committed to being carbon neutral across all of its worldwide operations by raising a price of carbon internally and imposing a carbon fee on its operating units, which is then used to invest in internal reductions, renewable energy certificates, and offsets. Marks and Spencer's, really within its Plan A and its carbon neutral commitment within Plan A, has focused a lot of its attention on the global nature of climate change and has really begun to engage its supply chain partners in actions which respond to both adapting to and mitigating climate change across its supply chains all around the world. And finally, Avis, which has been a client of ours for probably 14 years now, has really embraced new business model innovation through its acquisition of a very different style or model of car leasing with the Zipcar acquisition. So, we think that the IPCC's report is a game changer. And what it means for business is that CFOs really need to get involved. Carbon management is about business risk. It's becoming much more about business risk. Compliance and resilience. And strategic decision-making really needs to be integrated into the investment decisions of a business. We also expect that consumers and stakeholder expectation is going to increase. The scientific facts have been made clear by this report and will be made clearer by the forthcoming 2 reports, and consumers and stakeholders will expect businesses to demonstrate their action, which must be credible and significant. And of course, it's a global challenge, and businesses really need to think beyond their immediate boundary and understand the risk and responsibilities of their broader supply chain in order to demonstrate impactful action. And then finally, and I think this is really at the hub of this, with the nexus of this, economic growth and reduction in carbon impact are not mutually exclusive. Businesses can and have shown that they can develop strategies which combine both by considering the most cost-effective methods of carbon reduction, which deliver the greatest number of emission reductions. So I think that just about that takes me to the questions, really, at this stage. And a couple have come in, and I just need to... Which ones are we? Right, okay. So we'll probably have time to take just one or two. The first question that came in is that noting that there's been a pause in global warming over the last 15 years, and how does that get factored into the IPCC's view that we have a rising climate? And I think the short, I am not, of course, a scientist, but I think the answer that I've heard and that the IPCC uses are not able to predict short-term variability in climate. There's great confidence that the longer-term trends, the interdecadal rise in climate change is well understood and predictable, and so the results or their predictions are solid in that respect. And also there's a second reason for that, which is we do see pauses or hiatus within the known record of climate change historically. There are reasons for that scientists haven't fully proved, and that is the one that's most pointed to in the last hiatus is the warming of the oceans. In other words, the oceans acting as something of a sink in absorbing additional energy. And then a final, I think a final question given the timing. There's a question which said, I'll just try and summarize this. We're talking about very long time frames to 2100. How do we take action now that still makes sense in the long term and delivers business value? And I think I suppose the short answer I'd like to give to that is to point to the examples that I gave on the previous slide: Avis, Microsoft, Marks and Spencer's, and B Sky B. I think there are many, many actions that companies can take which deliver short-term value in one of three ways, and also get them on the pathway to a low or no carbon future. The first are, there's a lot of energy efficiency gains where we save money, energy, and greenhouse gases, and most businesses have not fully tapped that yet. Secondly, as we mentioned, consumers and clients care about this issue and tend, all other factors being equal, to favor companies who are part of the solution and not part of the problem. And as we showed with perhaps the Microsoft example, there is a sense that policy responses to the IPCC report can impose restrictions and restraints on business, and future-proofing a business by taking on voluntary carbon prices or reductions really helps business get ready for a carbon-constrained world. So, one final question. Will slides be online after the presentation? Yes, we will be making some information from this available to people, and we'll send out a note on how that will happen. So I think we're really at the edge of our time, and I would like to thank you all very much for attending and also for your questions. We'd very much welcome your feedback and be happy to answer any questions and to hear from you if you'd like any more information about this or our services. And of course, contact information is on the slide. So again, we're about to close the webinar. Thank you again so much for attending.